Can you imagine the shock of finding out that you're pregnant with quadruplets? You can actually ask my parents about that, because that's the shock they experienced 22 years ago when they stared into the ultrasound monitor and saw not one beating heart, but 4 beating hearts. Now, my parents had actually been trying to conceive for a while, and so they were overjoyed not only that they were pregnant, but that they would get the chance to bring 4 babies into the world at once. They were completely ready and willing to embrace this challenge. But what they weren't prepared for was when a nurse, on their way out of the ultrasound, handed them a card and said nonchalantly, "Don't worry, they will take care of it." Now, if my parents had listened to the advice of that nurse, I most likely wouldn't be here today. Because one of those hearts on the monitor was my own, and that card was to a local abortion clinic. So as you can see, the abortion issue has always been a personal issue to me. And I realize it might be a personal issue to some of you watching this as well. And I, of course, don't mean to condemn you for choices you can't do anything about in your past. But I do want to persuade you for a future we can shape. Because you see, as I've studied more and more about the abortion issue, I've realized that science is overwhelmingly clear that life begins at conception, that you are a distinct human being the moment you are conceived. And so in our time today, I want to show you that human life really does begin at conception. I want to share a helpful tool called the SLED test. And then I want to use the SLED test to debunk a few pro-abortion arguments. So first of all, human life begins at conception. And I can't really think of a better way to make a case for this than to just share this quote from the American College of Pediatricians. This quote says, "The predominance of human biological research confirms that human life begins at conception, at fertilization. At fertilization, the human being emerges as a whole, genetically distinct, individuated, zygotic living human organism, a member of the species Homo sapiens, needing only the proper environment in order to grow and develop. The difference between the individual in its adult stage and in its zygotic stage is one of form, not of nature." And so, as this quote clearly lays out, human biological research does confirm that you are a distinct human being at conception. Your DNA is different than that of your parents. You're not your mom's DNA, and you're not your dad's DNA. All you need is the right environment, the womb, to keep growing into the human being you already are. So with this in mind, I want to introduce you to what we pro-lifers call the SLED test. And now, the SLED test is really just an acronym. It breaks down these 4 different categories that pretty much every justification for abortion falls into. These 4 categories are size and appearance, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. As you can see, pretty much every justification for why we can abort a fetus or an embryo or a baby in the womb boils down to one of these 4. And what I want to point out is that none of these 4 is a good reason to abort. If it really is true that a human being is distinct and living at conception, then this becomes a very clear human rights issue. You can't take any of these 4 characteristics outside of the womb and apply them to a human being and then justify aborting them or doing away with them. For instance, my size as a 6'5" man doesn't give me any more rights or any more value than my 5'2" sister. So now that I've defined this SLED test, I want to use it to debunk a few pro-abortion arguments. The first one is this meme that you've probably seen floating around social media. It states that this is not a chicken, this is not a tree, this is not a dress, and I still have no clue what that has to do with the whole issue. But then they'll continue, this is not a person. And it looks fairly convincing from the outside, and that's exactly the point. They're using a picture of size and appearance to define something as human or not. But again, something's size or something's appearance doesn't necessarily make it human or not. We got to go deeper to what science confirms and what DNA proves, that this is actually a human being. We're human beings simply because of what we are, not of what we look like or what our size is. There's also certain benchmarks that pro-abortion advocates will try to make the preborn reach before they're considered a baby. Some of these are either a heartbeat or something like consciousness. And now, as you can see, that's really just an argument for level of development. And again, if the embryo really is a human being from conception, it's not a good argument that just because they don't have a heartbeat or just because they're not conscious, we can abort them. For instance, if I were to keel over right now with a heart attack, I hope you would rush to me and help me as a human being and not just look at me and say, oh man, that poor clump of cells. And so there's also another argument or another slogan that's tossed around that says, my body, my choice. And really, if you look at that, it's really just arguing that something's environment or their degree of dependence on their mom defines whether you can abort them or not. And if you take that outside of the womb and say a child living in the environment of a parent's home who depends on their parents to survive, if you look at it that way, obviously a parent can't just do away with the child because they depend on them or because they're in the environment of the parent's home. So I hope you can see how, since the science of embryology increasingly, overwhelmingly supports the fact that you are a distinct human being at conception, that abortion becomes a very important human rights issue for the preborn. And that's especially true once we apply the SLED test. We wouldn't want any of these characteristics to define what's human life outside of the womb, and we shouldn't apply them inside of the womb as well. And again, I realize that if you've had an abortion or been involved in encouraging someone to have an abortion, I realize that there's some emotions and personal feelings wrapped up in this. And again, I don't mean to condemn you, but my goal here is to persuade us for the future, so that when we see a single-celled embryo or even 4 beating hearts on a monitor screen, the only thing we'll mean by they'll take care of them is to provide the human life inside the womb with a safe environment to continue to grow into the human being they already are. Thank you so much for your time.